Roman Empire, more specifically Western Roman Empire's fall, started with a rumor and ended with fragmentation of its territory. A slow and painful death that spread for at least a century. Sometimes in the mid 375 AD, a rumor reached Rome of some heavy fighting around Black Sea, deep into enemy's territory. Infighting amongst Germanic barbarians tribe was nothing new. The only thing they hated more than the Romans was each other. That's why they only had limited success against Roman war machine. Sure, every once in a while they could annihilate the Roman army in an ambush when they would ally with each other, but those alliances would never last. Barbarians inhabited vast territory, referred to as Germania. It combined territory of Central and Eastern Europe. Since this rumor was coming from the fringes of this territory, it was a little unusual for it to travel such a distance, but it was dismissed by the court. Until a few months later, two groups of Goths, Tervings and Greutungi, showed up at the banks of river Danube and requested asylum from the empire. At this point, there were already two emperors of Roman Empire. A mechanism Emperor Diocletian established some 80 years before that, while the Western Emperor was keeping an eye on the river Rhine and the barbarians that lied on the other side in Eastern Germania. The Eastern Emperor was busy with dealing with the powerful neighbor to the east, Persia. Neither of them had enough troops to deny entrance to the Goths anyways, so they decided to fulfill their demands in part. It was nothing unusual for the empire to resettle outside tribes inside Roman Empire and make them citizens. These guys showed up in unfortunate moment. Anyhow, the empire decided to let in the Tervings tribe but not Greutungi, which stayed on the other side of the Danube bank. Still in close communication with the Tervengi. With emperors both being distracted, the burden of dealing with asylum seekers fell on the bureaucrats and local military commanders. So first things first, everybody was curious what happened. So apparently there was a new nomadic tribe that rode from the Eurasian steppes into the territories of Germanic tribes. They were known as the Huns. To this day, it is unclear who exactly were they, where they came from, or why they broke into Europe at this specific time. There are different theories of their origin. One plausible one is that they came all the way from China, but we just don't know. Also, most likely, they were roaming Eurasian steppes for centuries. Why they decided to show up now, it is unclear. Maybe they were running away from something even more terrifying. Maybe because of pure curiosity, or maybe because the steppes dried up and it was increasingly difficult to find food for their animals. But anyways, let's get back to our Goths. Tervings were met with mistreatment by the local officials the moment they were let in. They were met with food shortage, and high illegal market prices were doing them no favors. A few months later, they already got sick of it, and they revolted. They were helped by the Greutungs, who also crossed Danube. The so-called Gothic War between those two tribes and the Romans lasted for 6 years. The Goths were winning battles, but they knew they can't win a war against Rome. So a peace treaty was struck in the year 382. Both tribes were allowed in, and they promised to send able-bodied men into Roman army. Those two tribes, in the next 2 decades, living side by side, will evolve into a single tribe, the Visigoths. Just when it seemed that situation had been stabilized, the new crisis emerged at the beginning of the 5th century. In 405, a massive influx of barbarians into Gaul happened. They were running for their lives while being chased by the Huns, who apparently moved deeper into Germania. The Goths, Vandals, Suevi, Alans, Burgundies, even some Huns broke into Gaul. Nothing unifies disunified people like an existential threat. The Goths went straight into Italy, where they were defeated by the Romans, but some 10,000 warriors will desert to the Visigoths, who were settled in the Balkans. The rest of the newcomers were just roaming through Gaul. Suevis and Vandals went into Roman Hispania, modern-day Spain. Next, in 406, the Roman Britain elected a king who crossed into Gaul, taking the northern Gaul. Britain rebellions were not that unusual, but this one came at a very bad moment. To make everything way worse, the Visigothic king Alaric, encouraged by the influx of the new Gothic warriors and unhappy with the previous deal with the Rome, decided to use the opportunity, and in 410 he besieged and broke into Rome. For the second time in 800 years, the walls of Rome had been breached. Since at this point both Romans and the Visigoths were Christians, the sack of Rome was not as terrible as it could have been. They spared a lot of churches, buildings, and lives. And the truth is, for the past few centuries, the emperors were spending less and less time in Rome. So it did lose its political value, but still losing it to the Visigoths was a huge blow to morale of the Romans. But also it showed that rich landowners were willing to make a deal with invading forces as long as they were able to keep their riches and privileges. But in the next decade, Rome almost made a full comeback. Flavius Constantius, later as Emperor Constantius III, took the reins of the Western army and got to work. He pacified most of Gaul. The Roman Britain was lost, but he did manage to beat the Brits that crossed into Gaul. Visigoths' king Alaric had died, and Visigoths were once more made an allies of Rome. So the only problem left were Alans and the Vandals in Hispania. But before having a chance to deal with them, Constantius III died in 421 AD. After a few years of confusion, a new general rose to the occasion, another Flavius, Flavius Aetius. He defeated a new wave of barbaric invasion and cleaned up pockets of resistance in Gaul. When the Vandals crossed into Africa and took a few cities alongside the coast, he made a deal with them. However, with the Huns moving in closer and closer, and Flavius being distracted by this new threat, the Vandals took Carthage and all of Africa. One of the richest Roman provinces were suddenly in the hands of the enemy. The influx of gold and food from that province into Italy had been stopped suddenly. And then, as the final punishment by the gods, the new leader of the Huns shows up on the scene, Attila the Hun. He took control of the Huns from his uncle in 440 AD. He wasted no time. For the next 10 years, he rained havoc on Eastern Roman Empire. When finally, the Eastern Emperor made a deal with Attila, obligating himself to pay 2,100 pounds of gold per year, to pay ransom for all the captured Roman soldiers, and promise not to take any more refugees coming from the territories controlled by the Huns. And then, Attila turned his attention to the west. In the spring 451, he took the same route barbarians took some 45 years ago, across Rhine into Gaul. When it comes to numbers of his army, the most reliable source comes from historian Jordanes, who lived 200 years after the events. He said that the numbers might have been as high as 500,000 warriors, but even he was skeptical of such a high number. It is true that the Huns subjugated barbaric tribes under their rule, so the numbers were truly impressive. Anyways, in just a few months they penetrated deeply into Roman Gaul, and in June reached the city of Orleans. But Rome had a secret weapon of their own, Aetius, the so-called last of the Romans. He gathered his troops and all of his barbaric allies and marched into Gaul. By mid-June, he lifted the siege of Orleans and Attila retreated north. Aetius followed. The two armies finally clashed on 20th of June on the plains of Catalaunian fields. Who won the battle is hard to say. It looks like it was a stalemate. However, for the first time, an obstacle he couldn't overcome, Attila retreated and withdrew his forces from Gaul. A year later, Attila, seeking revenge, will break into northern Italy and raid the cities. But as the story goes, after the fall of Milan, Pope Leo, as the part of peace embassy, convinced Attila not to attack Rome. And Attila once more retreated behind the Roman borders. Not to dismiss Pope Leo's bravery, but the truth was Attila's army was experiencing food shortages, diseases, and they were losing a lot of men by Roman army led by Aetius. The Eastern Empire also got a new emperor, who decided to raid Huns settlements across the Danube. The truth was, as effective the Huns were in battle, they were pretty unorganized in prolonged war. They couldn't go toe-to-toe with Romans' logistics. In early 453, Attila planned another invasion. But during the wedding night, after heavy drinking, he suddenly started bleeding and died. The Rome was victorious, but at what cost? Like we said, the North Africa had been lost to the Vandals. Effective rule of Britain had been lost decades ago. Sueves used Aetius being distracted by the Huns, and soon they took over most of Roman Hispania. The Visigoths and Burgundies already established semi-autonomous kingdoms in southern Gaul. Aetius couldn't mobilize his armies to try to take back the lost regions because he needed them in Italy in case of another Hunnic invasion. And the areas that were still under full control of Rome were either raided or there was just not enough resources to feed whatever was left of the empire. Rome was able to defend herself from the Huns, and yet it was the Huns who brought Rome down indirectly. The fall of Rome started in 376, when the first Goths were chased away into Roman territory, and it continued 40 years later when Alans, Vandals, Burgundies, Sueves, Goths crossed into Gaul, running away from the Huns. In 455, Roman Emperor Valentinian III, who was in power for 29 years at that point, was killed by the supporters of Aetius, who was clubbed to death by Valentinian a year before. And from then on, for the next 21 years, there will be 10 emperors, a period of infighting, factionalism, betrayal. Scholars usually take 476 AD as the year the Western Roman Empire ended, with a 10-year-old boy, Romulus Augustus, as the last Western Roman emperor.